She spent 4 years rebuilding a rare Shelby Cobra, only to have her mother-in-law sell it behind her back for $3,000, 0 cents. Madeline Whitmore was dismissed, silenced, and stolen from by the very people who claimed to be family. But what they didn't expect was her silence turning into strategy. This isn't just a story about a car. It's about betrayal, justice, and the quiet fire of a woman reclaiming her worth. When the law fails to protect what matters most, how far will you go to take it back? Watch Whitmore, a story of legacy, loss, and a comeback they never saw coming. The moment I stepped into the garage, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the silence. That sterile stillness was normal. In this part of San Diego's quiet neighborhoods, it wasn't even the faint scent of motor oil that always lingered in the concrete. It was the absence. An emptiness so loud, it echoed. The spot where my Shelby Cobra had sat for the past 4 years, where I'd spent thousands of hours restoring it, bolt by bolt, memory by memory, was now just a dark stain on the floor. And then there was her voice. Elaine Whitmore's tone was far too cheerful for a Monday. She stood inside my garage, her meticulously pressed blouse glowing in the sun pouring through the side window. She held a folded stack of bills in one hand like a magician who'd just pulled a trick from her sleeve. "Perfect timing. I have wonderful news." I didn't answer. My eyes swept the room. Where the Cobra had been, the dustless shape it left behind, the space now obscenely clean. Gone, too, was the toolbox I'd inherited from Grandpa Whitmore, complete with his snap-on wrenches and calibration kit. It was as if someone had reached into my chest and hollowed me out. "Where's the Cobra?" I asked, the question flat, premeditated, already heavy with dread. Elaine beamed. Like a child expecting praise for a drawing no one asked for. "I sold that rusty old thing for you. Got $3,000, 0 cents cash. Can you believe it? Honestly, I think it was a generous price for something in that condition." I stared at her, unmoving. "You sold it." "Yes, dear. For your own good." She smoothed down her silver bob, smug in her certainty. "Mark agrees with me. You've spent far too much time out here tinkering with parts instead of doing something more appropriate. Maybe gardening. Or tennis." I didn't hear the rest. My eyes locked on the empty spot where my life's work used to rest. My 1967 Shelby Cobra 427, not just a car, one of only 348 ever made. A rare, roaring creature I'd purchased as a rusted shell and brought back to life with nothing but grit, manuals, and my late grandfather's tools. I stepped closer, noticing how Elaine clutched the bills against her chest like a protective charm. "Who did you sell it to?" "Oh, just a sweet young man, found my Craigslist ad. He said he was looking for a project car. I told him it needed work, of course, but he didn't seem to mind. He was excited. I even gave him all those cluttering tools. He said he'd never seen a snap-on torque set that old." My knees nearly buckled. She didn't know. Or worse, she did and just didn't care. "You gave him the tools?" I asked, breath catching. "Well, they were all dusty and disorganized. I thought—" "That was my grandfather's set." Elaine blinked, visibly thrown off. "Well, dear, I didn't realize it had sentimental value." "No, Elaine. It didn't just have sentimental value. That set is worth more than this house." She hesitated for the first time. I inhaled slowly, steadying the tremor in my chest. "Do you have any documentation?" "Of course I do." "I'm not careless," she huffed, pulling a crumpled piece of notebook paper from her bag. "See? A handwritten bill of sale, signed and everything. No title transfer, no ID verification, just 2 names scrawled in cheap pen." I took the paper and folded it into my coat pocket. I didn't look angry. I didn't raise my voice. That, perhaps, disturbed her more than yelling ever could. "You're welcome, dear," she added nervously. "I just want what's best for you. Mark will be so pleased when he—" "Hears?" I interrupted gently. Would you mind staying here a moment? I just need to make a quick call. Elaine smiled, clearly relieved. Of course, sweetheart. I stepped into the far corner of the garage, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I hadn't used in months. Carmen, I said as soon as the line picked up. It's Maddie. I need to report a theft. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. Then Carmen's voice, calm, focused, but threaded with concern. Start from the top. I didn't flinch. My mother-in-law sold my 1967 Shelby Cobra $427 without my permission. She put it on Craigslist, said she got $3,000 for it. It's gone, Carmen. A sharp breath from the other end. The Cobra? The one you were restoring for Barrett Jackson? The same. I glanced back at Elaine, who was now wiping down the counter with unnecessary zeal, likely trying to make herself feel useful. She didn't just sell the car. She gave away my grandfather's entire Snap-on collection. Jesus, Maddie. Carmen's voice dropped. That's not just theft. That's destruction of high-value property. Do you have anything to go on? I've got the handwritten bill of sale. No license plate or ID recorded. Just a first name, some scrawled address, and a barely legible signature. I could hear Carmen already scribbling. You still live in San Diego, right? Good. I've got some contacts over at the department. I'll run what I can. These types of scams happen more often than people think, especially with vintage cars listed by family members who don't know what they're doing. Or, in this case, don't care. She thought she was helping, I muttered, not sure who I was trying to convince anymore. You still have the VIN for the car? Of course. Good. Send me everything. I'll dig. I hung up and texted the documents to Carmen, then turned to face Elaine again. She was now attempting to organize my socket sets by color, her back turned to me like she owned the place. All taken care of, I said, my voice smooth as silk. Elaine turned, clearly satisfied. I knew you'd see reason, dear. I didn't reply. I just watched her as she gathered her purse, the cash tucked inside like a reward. I'll be going now, and remember, this is really for the best. You'll see. You can finally use this space for something more sensible. As she walked out of the garage and back into the main house, I was left alone with the echo of her footsteps and the cold, aching hollow where the Cobra used to be. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the concrete floor, and in that dimming light, I could still see the outline of where the tires had rested. I could still smell oil and steel, and the faint memory of my grandfather's cologne. Bay rum and engine grease. It wasn't just a car. It was 4 years of scraped knuckles and late nights. It was a connection to the only family member who ever truly understood me. Every bolt I turned was a moment of clarity, every smoothed panel a piece of healing. Elaine saw junk. I saw legacy. I locked the garage behind me that night and didn't say a word to Mark when he called to check in from Chicago. I listened to his voicemail, full of updates about meetings and flight delays, and I didn't respond. Not yet. I needed time to feel the loss fully before deciding what came next. But I knew one thing with certainty. They thought they'd strip me down to nothing. But all they'd really done was prove how little they valued what I built and who I was. And that, more than anything, was their mistake. Because you can steal a car. You can even sell a set of tools that weren't yours to touch. But you can't erase a woman who knows exactly what was taken from her and exactly how to take it back. 2 days later, I sat at my desk in the corner of Whitman and Rowe Engineering, staring at the spreadsheet that had been open for an hour and untouched. Stress analysis numbers for a suspension bridge project. Normally, I'd find the work grounding. There's something oddly comforting about calculating loads and tensile strength. But my mind wasn't on steel or math. It was on the silence in my garage. A new message pinged on my phone, pulling me from the page. It was from Carmen. Ran preliminary search, no DMV record for buyer's name. David Johnson doesn't exist at listed address. Craigslist account deleted, phone disconnected, Working theory. Pro-car thief will keep digging. I wasn't surprised. There had been something too smooth about Elaine's story, something too convenient about the boy who'd seemed so excited to buy a car he didn't even look at. But this confirmation felt like a steel rod snapping in my chest. I texted back, "Thank you. Let me know what you need from me." Then I minimized the spreadsheet, got up, and walked out of the office without a word. 15 minutes later, I was back in my garage. My safe place. Or it had been. The air inside was stale with loss, but I needed to be there, to feel it, to remember. I walked to the back workbench where I'd once kept Grandpa's tools. The drawers now hung slightly open, hollow. All that remained were a few mismatched bolts and a sticky note I'd scribbled months ago listing back-ordered parts from a specialty shop in Arizona. Underneath, tucked against the back wall, I found something I'd forgotten. An old photo of Grandpa and me standing in front of the Kuda he once owned. I looked about 12, grinning, engine grease streaking my cheek like war paint. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel the ache anymore. Just clarity. I walked back into the house and sat at the kitchen table, spreading out the documents I'd printed. The appraisal report, photos of the Cobra at every stage of its restoration, my grandfather's original tool manifest, every piece catalogued and valued, and of course the pathetic bill of sale Elaine had waved at me like proof of wisdom. On notebook paper, no IDs, no witnesses, no legal standing. I compiled everything into a scanned file and sent it to Carmen. Not 10 minutes later, she called. "I just spoke to someone at a specialty dealer in Scottsdale," she said. "They handled a consignment yesterday, a 67 Shelby Cobra 427 matching VIN to yours." My breath caught. "Already?" "Yup. Sold for $250,000, 0 cents, to a collector named James Morrison. Reputable guy. Doesn't flip, keeps everything he buys." "And the seller?" "Unverified," she replied. "Dealer says it was a walk-in. Gave a fake name, no driver's license copy, but the transaction is recorded and the VIN matches your documentation." "And Morrison?" "He's alarmed. Said he'll cooperate however needed." I exhaled slowly. "So we can build a chain. From me to Elaine, from Elaine to the thief, from him to the dealer. Then to Morrison." "We're building it now," Carmen said. "And Maddie? Yeah, I'm sorry, I know what that car meant to you." I paused. It's not just about the car anymore. I ended the call and looked back at the garage through the window. The light was fading, but in the reflection, I saw myself not as the woman who'd been robbed, but as the one who was going to expose them all. The morning fog still clung to the San Diego skyline as I sat in my car outside the engineering firm, hands gripping the steering wheel long after I'd parked. Inside, a stack of bridge schematics and load-bearing simulations waited on my desk. But my mind wasn't on suspension points or earthquake tolerances. It was on a single phrase Carmen had used the night before: professional buyer. That's what she'd call him, the man who took my car. Not some hobbyist, not a kid who got lucky, a predator. The kind who combed Craigslist listings for undervalued classics, especially ones sold by clueless relatives with too much access and too little understanding. Elaine had handed him a masterpiece, then smiled as if she'd done me a favor. I finally stepped out of the car and walked into the office, ignoring the morning chatter of colleagues. I sat at my desk, logged in, and opened my email. Carmen had sent over the dealership name, Prescott Heritage Motors, located just outside Scottsdale. Attached was a receipt from the dealer. Clean paper trail from David Johnson to them. The listed VIN matched my Cobra exactly. I stared at the screen, chest tight. The price? $250,000, 0 cents. I'd nearly choked. The dealer had made $250,000 from a car Elaine sold for the price of a used couch. And not just the car. She'd included the Snap-on set, My grandfather's legacy, his entire lifetime in metal and leather and steel, reduced to a bonus gift to make the sale easier. I closed the browser. My hands were shaking, not from rage anymore, but from calculation. This wasn't just about personal loss. This was now a matter of law. I texted Carmen. We have a number. Let's build the chain. I'll get you everything I've got. Then I pulled out the thick red folder from my drawer, the one marked Cobra. It held every receipt, photo, spec sheet, appraisal, and certification. I'd prepared it for Barrett Jackson, planning to sell the car officially at auction later this year. I scanned the entire thing into a shared drive and sent Carmen the link. She replied almost instantly. Got it. Already talking to Morrison. He's cooperative. He'll sign affidavit that he bought the car unknowingly and is willing to hold it while investigation proceeds. I stared at that message for a long moment. A collector, someone who actually valued what I'd built, was doing more to protect my legacy than the people who claimed to love me. Mark still hadn't called. Not even a text asking why I'd gone silent. Just the usual transaction-based updates. His flight had landed. The Chicago pitch had gone well. The hotel had decent room service. So I sent him a message instead. We need to talk. Not about the car. About what it really represented. No reply. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the distant skyline. The city buzzed, uncaring and intact. But something had shifted inside me. They had taken the Cobra, but they'd also handed me something far more valuable. A reason to burn the script and start rewriting everything. That evening, the house was too quiet. I could hear the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower, the occasional thud of something settling in the attic, but inside these walls, silence pressed in like insulation, the kind that doesn't comfort, it suffocates. I stood in the hallway, holding the divorce papers I'd printed earlier that day. They weren't filled out, not yet, but the very existence of them felt like a boundary drawn in ink. A warning, a reminder to myself. The door to the garage creaked as I opened it, letting in the familiar scent of grease, concrete, and old ambition. I stepped inside and flicked on the light. My gaze landed immediately on the oil stain where the Cobra had rested. 4 years of sweat and solitude poured into that spot. Now it was just a memory, a scar on the floor. I crouched down beside it, trailing my fingers through the outline, remembering how carefully I'd masked the edges when I painted the underbody. I'd known every bolt by name. Every curve had been coaxed from rust and ruin into precision. It had never just been about the car. It had been about proving I could build something lasting, something no one could take from me. Except they had. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Carmen. Dealer confirmed. Seller presented no ID, just a printed title copy, possibly forged. Morrison's affidavit incoming. With this chain, we're moving into theft and misrepresentation territory. DA's office already looped in? I exhaled. It was happening faster than I'd expected. I texted back, "Send me the affidavit when it's signed. I want a copy for my own files." As I set my phone aside, another notification slid across the screen. This one was from Mark. Mom told me what happened. Honestly, maybe it's for the best. We can finally use the garage for storage like normal people. I stared at the message for a long time. There it was. Not surprise, not apology, not even curiosity. Just dismissal wrapped in a veneer of practicality. I didn't reply. Instead, I went to the hallway closet and pulled down an old photo album. I hadn't looked through it in years. Inside were shots of Grandpa and me, his hands covered in grease, mine trying to imitate him with overlarge gloves. One photo stopped me, bold, the two of us standing in front of his Plymouth Kuda, the one he taught me to drive in. I was 16, wearing goggles too big for my face and beaming like I'd just won the Indy 500. That photo went on the fridge. A placeholder, not for grief, but for purpose. I spent the next hour cataloging what I still had: manuals, notes, restoration journals. The kind of detail even a thief could. I began organizing them into folders labeled with parts, tools, suppliers. It wasn't for a legal case. It was for me. The Cobra was gone. But the process, the discipline, the resilience, the knowing, I still had that. And as I stood at the edge of my emptied garage, I realized something Mark and Elaine never would. You can steal the object, you can even sell the legacy, but you can't touch the hands that built it. They'll just start again. The dining table had been set with surgical precision. 3 place settings, cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles, candles lit even though the sun hadn't yet set. Elaine always did love her theatrics. She called them family dinners, though they always felt more like auditions for a part I never wanted to play. I stood across from her at the far end of the table, folder in hand. Not my usual project reports or engineering diagrams. This one was heavier, thicker, personal. In it were photos, appraisals, receipts, truths bound in glossy paper and stapled corners. I didn't sit down. Elaine was already halfway through her glass of wine, radiating the same smug calm she'd worn the day she told me she'd taken care of the car situation. Across from her, Mark had just loosened his tie, still checking emails on his phone. When they finally did, Elaine was the first to speak. "Well, Madeline, we're glad you could make it. I thought a meal together might help ease the tension from last week." "Tension?" I said flatly. "Yes," she continued, like a director cueing the next scene. "Things were said, feelings got hurt, but we're a family, and families forgive." Mark nodded without meeting my eyes. "Let's not drag this out longer than it needs to." I didn't answer. I opened the folder and laid the first photo on the table. The Cobra, before I'd touched it. Rusted. Half buried under years of dust in a Texas barn. Elaine squinted at it. "Is this supposed to mean something?" I slid the next image forward. The same car, mid-restoration, stripped down to the frame, primered and clean, my tools neatly aligned in the background, the snap-on boxes gleaming like altars to craftsmanship. Elaine's wine glass paused midway to her lips. "This," I said quietly, "is what you sold." The next photo landed like a hammer. The finished Cobra, chrome flawless, paint shimmering in the low light of the garage. Every line restored, every imperfection erased. Mark finally looked up, his expression shifting. "Wait, that's the same car?" I nodded. "Appraised at $400,000, going to Barrett Jackson next spring." Elaine's face paled. "You're exaggerating. I have paperwork. You want to see the certificate?" She didn't respond. "And the tools you gave away? They weren't just some old junk from Home Depot. They were my grandfather's. Some of those pieces were irreplaceable." She started, but the words caught. I looked at Mark. "You let her do it. You gave her the keys. You let her make a choice that wasn't hers to make." He sank back in his chair. "She didn't mean harm. She just didn't think I mattered enough to ask." The silence that followed was colder than anything I'd brought into the room. I pulled out the final document from the folder, a printed copy of the affidavit James Morrison had signed, confirming the purchase and current possession of the car. Carmen's been in contact with the DA. Morrison is cooperating fully. We have the entire chain of custody. From me to Elaine, to the thief, to the dealer, to him. Elaine's voice was barely a whisper. "They wouldn't charge family." I didn't smile. "They would, and they are." Elaine's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table, her composure slipping like a silk scarf in the wind. "Madeline," she said slowly, voice shaking under its polished veneer, "you're not seriously considering going through with this." "I'm not considering anything," I replied, my tone level. "The DA is." Mark finally pushed his plate aside, his eyes darting between us like a man realizing too late that the building was already on fire. "Come on, Maddie, it's your mother." "She's not my mother," I said sharply, meeting his gaze. She's your mother. And she committed a felony. Elaine looked like she'd been slapped. Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping. You're going to have her arrested over a car? It's never been about the car, I said. It's about how easily you both dismissed what I've built. You didn't just oosh a vehicle, Mark. You lost me the day you decided her judgment was more valid than mine. The weight of that truth hung between us, heavy and irreversible. The walls of the dining room, decorated with curated family portraits and high-end art pieces Elaine insisted on framing herself, seemed to close in with the silence that followed. Elaine stood abruptly, smoothing the wrinkles from her blouse. Well, if this is how you want to repay kindness, I suppose that says more about you than it does me. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a thin envelope. I placed it carefully beside her untouched fork. That's an invoice. From the insurance adjuster who reviewed the stolen contents of my garage. $421,300, 0 cents in total losses, not including emotional damages or lost income from missing the Barrett-Jackson deadline. You can give it to your lawyer. Elaine didn't touch it. Mark stared at the envelope like it was radioactive. You're suing her. No, I corrected. I'm pressing charges. The civil suit comes after. His face crumpled with disbelief. You're really doing this? I'm already doing it. For a moment, no one moved. Then Elaine spoke again, her voice thin and bitter. You always were ungrateful. We gave you everything. A roof, a place in this family. You gave me a place, I said, as long as I didn't speak too loudly or take up too much space. As long as my passions stayed small and polite, I did everything right. I stayed quiet, I worked hard, I made myself useful, and still, you never saw me as anything but inconvenient. Elaine blinked rapidly, mascara threatening to run. I stood, folding the folder shut in one crisp motion. I'll let myself out. As I reached the door, Carmen's name lit up on my phone. I answered with a quiet, yes. Her voice was brisk. Just got off the call with Morrison's attorney. He signed the affidavit. Dealer's already submitted the sales documentation to us. It's locked in, Maddie. I turned the doorknob and stepped out into the night. The air smelled different, like metal and jasmine. Like summer arriving early. Thanks, Carmen. Keep me posted. I will. And Madeline, she added just before hanging up. I hope you're ready, because the Whitmores won't stay quiet for long. I looked back at the house one last time, shining in its perfection, hollow in its warmth, and walked away without a word. Let them talk. Let them panic. I wasn't done yet. The letter from the district attorney's office arrived 2 days later, delivered in a manila envelope with a discreet seal and a line of black print that read San Diego County Criminal Division. I opened it at my kitchen table, alone, with the same calm precision I used when tightening a torque wrench. Inside was the official notice. The state of California intended to pursue felony charges against Elaine Whitmore for unlawful sale and misappropriation of high-value property. I read the words twice, slowly, and then slid the letter back into the envelope. No celebration, no tears, just gravity. Elaine had always believed she was untouchable. She wore her last name like armor, her role as matriarch like a crown. But the law didn't care about family trees. It cared about intent, value, paper trail, and Carmen had given them all 3. I left the envelope on the table and stepped into the garage. The lights flickered on overhead, casting long shadows across the vacant concrete where the Cobra had once sat. I walked to the back workbench, where I'd started storing my tools again. What few I'd been able to recover and what new replacements I could afford. A file folder sat on the bench, labeled Kuda Project Phase 1. Blank, for now, but not for long. My phone buzzed. Carmen. She's been served, she said. Mark was there. Apparently she fainted. I almost smiled. Almost? Did she say anything? She's claiming she didn't know the value, that she thought it was junk. I leaned against the counter. Intent won't matter. She sold what wasn't hers. She's retained a lawyer, Carmen added. But we've got Morrison, the dealer, your documentation, the appraisal. It's a clean case. I nodded to myself. What about the Cobra? Still in Morrison's climate-controlled facility. He's holding it until the case resolves. He's even offered to cover transport back to San Diego when it's cleared. That man is more of a family member than the people I married into, Carmen chuckled softly. Funny how that works. After the call ended, I sat in the quiet and watched the daylight crawl across the garage floor. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Brady. We need to talk, not about Mom, about us. I stared at the screen for a while, not with surprise, not with hope, but with the stillness of someone who had already moved past a conversation before it even began. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my laptop and began drafting the opening steps of the Kuda restoration, parts sourcing, structural inspection, paintwork planning. There was something healing about the rhythm of it, the familiar process of building, designing, reclaiming. I clicked on a photo of the Kuda. I'd saved months ago from a barn listing in Fresno. It was a wreck. Dented panels, faded paint, half its engine missing. But even in its broken state, I saw beauty. I saw promise. I saw not as someone wronged, but as someone rising. I met Carmen for coffee the next morning at a quiet place tucked into the edge of Balboa Park, where the tourists hadn't quite discovered the pastries and the staff knew her name. She arrived in her usual way, ponytail, black blazer, a folder under one arm, and a double shot of espresso already in her hand. You look like hell, she said by way of greeting. I feel worse, I replied, smiling faintly, but I'm upright. She slid into the booth across from me and opened the folder without preamble. Pre-trial hearing is set for 2 weeks from now. If Elaine's attorney doesn't cut a deal, the DA is ready to proceed with a full criminal complaint. I nodded, unsurprised. She's not going to cut a deal. She's too proud. Or too delusional. Carmen tapped the folder. This isn't just about the car anymore. The affidavit from Morrison is airtight. Dealer's documents match every timestamp. But what makes the case bulletproof is your documentation. The appraisals, the photo logs, the tool inventory. You didn't just build a car, Maddie, you built a case. I looked down at my coffee, fingers curling around the warm ceramic. I wasn't trying to, I didn't want anyone to forget what I'd done. What he taught me? Carmen's voice softened. He wouldn't have. We sat in silence for a beat. The city moved around us. Buses sighed at intersections. A dog barked in the distance. But between us, it was still, steady. Then Carmen said, You know there's going to be blowback. I'm counting on it. She raised a brow. You want them to lash out? I want them to show the world exactly who they are when they're not in control. Later that afternoon, back at the house, I stood in the hallway and listened as Mark came through the front door. He didn't call my name, just set down his briefcase and walked to the kitchen like it was any other day. I waited, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe. When he finally noticed me, he froze mid-step. I got your message, he said, his voice low, about talking. I gestured to the dining room. The same table where, just nights ago, I'd laid out everything, photos, appraisals, evidence. It looked no different now, and yet everything had changed. He sat down, not across from me this time, but beside me. A calculated move, as if proximity might substitute for apology. I didn't know it was worth that much, he began. That's not the point. He hesitated. Then what is? I turned to him. You never asked. He opened his mouth, closed it. For once, he didn't have a retort. I continued, calm and measured. In 6 years, you never stepped into the garage unless you needed storage space. You never asked why I was restoring it. Never asked how much I'd learned, how many nights I'd spent bleeding into that car. You didn't see me, Mark. Not really. And when your mother took everything, your first instinct was to defend her. He shifted, looking away. She didn't mean to hurt you. She meant to control me. And you let her. We sat in the weight of it. I'm not trying to punish you, I said quietly. But I'm not going to protect you from the consequences either. His voice cracked. Are we done? I didn't answer right away. I looked past him, out the window where the trees swayed in a warm coastal wind. I think we've been done for a long time, I said. We just didn't want to say it out loud. He didn't try to argue, he just nodded, and for once I believed he understood. The courthouse was quieter than I expected. I'd arrived early, wearing the navy blazer I used to reserve for client meetings, the one with sharp shoulders and a hidden interior pocket where I kept a thumb drive and a miniature socket gauge. Old habits. Carmen stood next to me, reviewing the final paperwork. Her presence wasn't official, but her eyes scanned every page like the cop she still was at heart. Brady hadn't shown up yet. I took a seat on the wooden bench outside Department 405, a small courtroom tucked in the family law wing of the San Diego Superior Court. The air smelled like dust and decades of tired apologies. My name was on the docket as petitioner. Mark Whitmore was the respondent. 6 years, I thought. 6 years of thank you notes to his clients, family barbecues where I was expected to bring potato salad and silence, 6 years of just let mom handle it, and it's not a big deal. The big deal had arrived now, in the form of divorce filings and an upcoming criminal trial. When Brady finally appeared, he looked exactly as he always did. Press shirt, expensive watch, sleeves rolled just enough to seem casual. But his face had changed. The polish had dulled. The certainty was gone. He sat on the opposite bench, not a word. Inside, the hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. Neither of us contested the separation. There were no shared children, no businesses, no joint property that wasn't already compromised by Elaine's theft. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense tone, reviewed the paperwork, asked 2 clarifying questions, then nodded once. Dissolution granted, she said. Effective immediately. Just like that, it was over? I walked out first, Carmen beside me. Brady lingered behind. On the steps of the courthouse, the air felt clearer, lighter somehow, like the first inhale after leaving a burning room. You okay? Carmen asked. Not yet, I said, but I'm getting there. We stopped for coffee at a spot near Little Italy where the tables were too close together and the espresso was unforgivingly strong. I didn't need caffeine, I just needed to sit somewhere that didn't echo. Carmen stirred her drink without looking at me. You're handling this better than I would. I gave a dry laugh. You would have punched someone by now. Only if I thought it would help. We sipped in silence. The table next to us was filled with 2 college-age girls showing each other photos of their dogs. For a moment, the world felt strangely normal. Then Carmen leaned forward. Morrison asked if he could reach out to you directly. I raised an eyebrow. Why? He said he's got something for you. And no, it's not the car. That sparked something. Not curiosity exactly, but something adjacent. Fine, give him my number. Carmen's eyes softened. You're really done with the Cobra, aren't you? I didn't answer right away. I just looked past her to the street, where a delivery truck rumbled by, the driver tapping the wheel in time with music I couldn't hear. I think that version of me is done, I said, but something new's coming. I can feel it. And for the first time since the garage went empty, I actually believed it. I drove back to the house one last time. It felt strange, knowing it wouldn't be mine much longer. The driveway still had faint oil stains from the Cobra, and the side gate creaked like it always did, no matter how many times I sprayed it. Muscle memory had me reaching for the keypad at the front door before I remembered. The code would be changed within days, maybe even hours. The inside looked exactly as I'd left. Immaculate, curated, cold. Elaine's idea of decor involved symmetry and silence. The walls bore no photos of us, only expensive prints in matching frames, as though intimacy was something to be arranged and dusted. I walked through the room slowly, taking stock. There wasn't much I wanted. A few books, my tools, the ones that had been returned after Morrison's team intervened, and a small box of personal files. That was it. Everything else had been either given, tolerated, or forced into my life. In the garage, the new owners would never know what had once lived there. They'd see an empty space, maybe a chance to build a home gym or install storage cabinets. They'd never see the outlines of tools, the patches of cement stained with solvent, the ghost of something powerful and irreplaceable. I reached for the last box and carried it to the car. Inside were blueprints I'd drawn of the Cobra's fuel system, a few faded photos of Grandpa, and the early sketches for the Kuda. Still raw, still possible. Back in the living room, I noticed something on the coffee table. A photo album. The wedding one. It hadn't been there when I left. I stared at it, unsure who placed it. Brady, most likely. One last olive branch, or maybe just an act of passive guilt. I didn't touch it. I had no desire to reopen pages where I already knew the ending. Instead, I left it exactly where it sat and scribbled a note on the back of an old utility bill nearby. Keep it. I'm done holding memories that never held me. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent. The light turned amber, casting long shadows across the lawn as I pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the house looked smaller than I remembered, like something shrinking under the weight of its own fiction. I drove north, past Mission Hills, up into the edges of the city, where the lots grew wider and the expectations lighter. There, tucked off a side street, just outside of town, sat my new beginning. A two-car garage, a small single-story house, and a stretch of driveway shaded by oaks. Quiet, uncomplicated, mine. I parked and unlocked the door. Inside, sunlight spilled across bare wood floors and empty walls, the kind that didn't carry judgment or history. In the garage, a single bulb hung from the ceiling, and on the far wall, a tarp covered what I'd towed in earlier that week. I pulled it off. The Kuda sat in the shadows, frame battered, paint nearly gone, but bones intact, solid, waiting. There was a knock at the front door. I wiped my hands on a rag and opened it to find a delivery driver holding a large box addressed to Madeline Whitmore. Inside, a wrapped crate of engine parts from Arizona and a handwritten note. Taped to the top. Thought you might want to start fresh. Your build, your rules, JM. I smiled, not wide, but real. The Cobra had been for legacy. The Kuda would be for me. The first time I fired up the Kuda's rebuilt engine, it didn't roar, it coughed. A low, reluctant sputter, half defiance, half exhaustion, before wheezing into silence. I didn't flinch. I didn't curse. I just leaned back on the creeper beneath the chassis, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and grinned. She was stubborn. Good. So was I. The garage still smelled like primer and sanded steel, but it was mine now. The floor had no memory of betrayal. The shelves held only tools I had chosen. Some new, some donated by Morrison, a few recovered pieces from Grandpa's collection that Carmen had helped me track down at auction. In the corner, an old Bluetooth speaker played Otis Redding on loop. The neighbors had already begun stopping by, first to ask if I needed help, then out of curiosity. A few had even brought over muffins or coffee or just questions. "You're building that?" they'd say, gesturing toward the Kuda like it was an alien spacecraft. And when I told them yes, they never looked at me with doubt, just awe. One afternoon, a teenager named Riley knocked on the open garage door. Thin frame, oversized hoodie, chip nail polish, and a backpack slung like armor across one shoulder. "You, the lady who builds cars?" she asked. "I am," I said, wiping my hands. "You hiring?" I paused, surprised. "Do you have any experience?" "Nope," she admitted, "but I've taken apart 3 bikes and my mom's toaster." "That toaster still work?" "Nope." I laughed. "Come back tomorrow. Wear shoes that can take a beatin'." She did. By the end of the first week, I'd taught her how to check spark plug gaps and how to torque lug nuts properly. By the second, she knew where every socket size lived and the difference between a flathead and a Phillips by feel. She listened, more than she spoke, but she never stopped watching. I recognized that hunger. I'd seen it in myself, standing in Grandpa's garage with hands too small for the wrenches and ambition too loud for the world I was born into. That Friday, as we wrapped up, Riley pointed to a photo I'd tacked to the wall. It was the finished Cobra, gleaming under the lights of the Barrett-Jackson showroom. Below it, a brass plate read, "Built by Madeline Whitmore, restored from ruin, reclaimed with purpose." "You built that?" she asked. "I did." "Why do you sell it?" I looked at her, at the grease under her fingernails, the dirt on her jeans, the way she didn't blink when asking hard things. "Because I needed to let it go," I said, "so I could build something for myself." She nodded, like she understood. Maybe she did. That night, after locking the garage, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and the quiet hum of summer cicadas. The legal proceedings had wrapped. Elaine had taken a plea, 5 years probation, restitution, and the public shame of having her name on record as a convicted felon. Mark and I hadn't spoken since the papers were signed. He'd moved downtown. Elaine stayed quiet. I didn't need revenge anymore. What I'd needed was this. An engine that didn't roar yet, but would. A girl who wanted to learn, a space that smelled like work, not fear. The past hadn't been erased. It had just been repurposed. The invitation came on a Thursday. Hand-delivered, handwritten, and wrapped in thick ivory cardstock that screamed inherited money and performative elegance. I found it wedged under the garage door late in the afternoon, stuck between an overdue utility bill and a flyer for gutter cleaning. "You are cordially invited to the Whitmore Foundation's annual gala, hosted by Elaine Whitmore, a night of legacy, honor, and family." I stood there in my work boots and oil-stained jeans, reading the words like they belonged to someone else's life. Family. The word soured in my mouth. For a second I thought about tossing it straight into the trash. But instead I walked into the garage, set it on the workbench, and stared at it, while the Kuda cooled behind me. The invitation wasn't just some desperate olive branch, it was a challenge, a stage. The Whitmores had always performed best in public, behind spotlights and tight smiles. They relied on silence, shame, and the assumption that no one would ever call them out. Maybe it was time to break the script. The night of the gala, I didn't arrive in a gown or a designer clutch. I came in boots, a fitted black blazer, and a simple white blouse. No jewelry, no pretense. My hair was tied back, face bare. I walked into the ballroom at the Fairmont Grand like it was a courtroom, not a celebration. Heads turned, conversations paused. Elaine, dressed in navy and pearls, froze mid-sentence. Mark saw me next. He looked older, thinner, but his mouth parted in a kind of reflexive awe I didn't care to acknowledge. I didn't smile. I didn't greet anyone. I walked to the edge of the room where the silent auction tables were arranged. Signed baseballs, rare wines, a weekend retreat in Napa. And front and center in a glass case was a framed photo of the Cobra. I stared at it, breath caught. Beneath it was a placard. A Whitmore family legacy. Donated by Brady Whitmore in honor of his late grandfather. It was a lie. A polished, public, well-funded lie. I turned slowly, caught Elaine's eye across the room, and raised my voice, not to yell, but just enough to carry. "That's not your legacy." The room went quiet. Elaine's mouth tightened. "Madeline, please. This isn't the time." "It's the perfect time," I said, stepping toward the photo. "This car wasn't built by your family. It was stolen from me. By you." A few gasps. Brady stepped forward. "Mads, don't do this." I looked directly at him. "Don't call me that." I turned back to the crowd. "This car was appraised at $400,000. I restored it over 4 years. Every bolt, every panel. It was my hands, my tools, my time. Not a dime from this family contributed to it. And yet, here it is, branded as a Whitmore achievement." Elaine tried to speak, but I cut her off. "You didn't just steal my work. You tried to erase me." Then I pulled a smaller frame from my bag and set it next to the Cobra photo. It was the Kuda. Unfinished, primered, raw. Below it I'd written, "Not for auction, not for legacy, for myself," and then I walked out. I didn't wait for applause or confrontation. I left behind gasps, stunned silence, and the sound of a family finally stripped of its illusion. Back at home, the garage lights were still on. Riley sat cross-legged near the back, studying the fuel system diagrams I'd drawn by hand. She looked up as I entered. "You okay?" I nodded. "Better than okay," she grinned. "Good. 'Cause I figured out where we went wrong with the timing chain." I smiled, grabbed a wrench, and joined her on the floor. The car would run soon, but tonight I already felt unstoppable. Thank you for joining Madeline's journey from betrayal to rebuilding, from silence to strength. This story isn't just about stolen property. It's about stolen identity and the quiet power of reclaiming it. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told to stay small, let this be your reminder. Your voice, your work, your truth matters. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. Keep building, keep rising, and never let anyone rewrite your story for you. If this story moved you, like, share, or subscribe for more powerful narratives like Madeline's. Your support means everything.